It was the winter of 2019 in the quiet town of Asheville, North Carolina. Snow covered the streets, softening the noise of traffic and muting the world into a silence that mirrored the emptiness inside a family that had already fractured long before. Inside the modest brick building of Rosewood Nursing Home, an elderly woman named Margaret Hayes sat by a window, her gaze lost in the whiteness of the morning frost. For neighbors and nurses, she was simply another fragile soul waiting for time to pass. But to her family, children and grandchildren who rarely visited, she was a memory they had chosen to bury while she was still alive. The decision had been framed as necessary. They said Margaret could no longer live alone, that she needed care. But the truth ran deeper and darker. Beneath the official reasons lay years of unspoken resentments, neglected phone calls, and moments when the comfort of distance seemed easier than the duty of love. What had once been a lively grandmother's house filled with laughter now stood empty, its windows darkened, while she quietly lived her last years surrounded by strangers. A letter found later would recall those days with haunting words. I wondered if the silence of my family hurt more than the silence of the night. The documentary record, dated medical charts, staff reports, and the lonely Christmas photos archived by the nursing home, tells a story of abandonment not written in headlines, but engraved in human hearts. Margaret's decline was not only physical. It was the emotional erosion of a woman who once gave everything, yet received so little in return. What no one in the Hayes family imagined was that, behind the wrinkles of forgotten days, behind the silence they had chosen to impose, Margaret had been carefully preparing her final act. For years, she had been writing, recording, and sealing letters, one for each family member. Her words, preserved on simple cassette tapes and handwritten envelopes, would not only carry her voice beyond the grave, but also reopen wounds that many had preferred to keep hidden. And when she passed away, in the cold January of 2020, those letters were unveiled alongside an unexpected revelation: an inheritance. Not vast fortunes of unimaginable wealth, but something that carried even more weight: a symbolic legacy that would challenge the very core of her family's fractured bonds. The story that unfolds is not about money alone. It is about shame, guilt, and a love that persisted, even in the silence of abandonment. This is the story of a grandmother who was forgotten, of the inheritance that was never about riches, and of the reconciliation that only forgiveness could bring. Because sometimes, the true inheritance is not what you hold in your hands, but what you allow to heal in your heart. Margaret Hayes had not always been a woman of silence. Decades earlier, her home had been the center of warmth, a place where Sunday dinners stretched long into the evening and grandchildren ran across the wooden floors with carefree laughter. She was born in 1941 in rural Virginia, into a family that carried both resilience and hardship. The eldest of 5 siblings, Margaret grew up quickly, helping her mother manage the household after her father's sudden death in a mining accident. It was in those years of scarcity that she learned to place others' needs above her own, to serve, to sacrifice, to love without condition. That pattern would define her entire life. By the time she married Thomas Hayes in 1962, Margaret had already earned a reputation as a woman of strength. Together, they built a modest life in North Carolina, raising 2 children, Evelyn, the eldest, and Daniel, the youngest. Their home became a sanctuary, not only for the family but for neighbors and relatives who always found in Margaret a listening ear and a warm meal. Old photographs preserved in family albums show her smiling in the kitchen, flour on her hands, her children clinging to her apron strings. She had a way of turning ordinary moments into memories, of making the simple feel extraordinary. But life was not always kind. When Thomas died suddenly of a heart attack in 1987, Margaret was left widowed at 46. She took a job as a seamstress at a local shop and stretched every dollar to keep her children in school. Evelyn became a teacher. Daniel pursued a career in business. And though they respected their mother's sacrifices, distance began to grow between them as they built lives of their own. Margaret, proud and quiet, never complained. She filled her time with her church, her garden, and later, with the joy of becoming a grandmother. In those first years of holding her grandchildren, Margaret felt she had been given back some of the life that grief had stolen. Christmas mornings at her house were magical. She baked cookies, wrapped gifts in careful paper, and whispered blessings into the ears of her little ones as they fell asleep on her couch. Yet beneath the surface, fractures were forming. Evelyn often argued with her mother about her brother, believing Margaret favored Daniel and excused his mistakes. Daniel, in turn, resented Evelyn for judging him, and slowly, unspoken rivalries spilled into the way the grandchildren were raised. Margaret, always seeking peace, avoided confrontation, but the seeds of division had already been planted. There was one Christmas in particular, in 2003, when the air in Margaret's home shifted. Evelyn had arrived late with her husband and children, her voice sharp as she criticized her brother for not contributing to their mother's bills. Daniel, defensive and bitter, shouted back that Evelyn only came around to look good in front of neighbors. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her eyes downcast, her hands trembling as she tried to cut the turkey. In that moment, she understood something that would haunt her for years. Her love was no longer enough to hold them together. The grandchildren, once inseparable, grew more distant as the rift between their parents deepened. Over the following years, Margaret grew older and her health began to waver. The once busy house became quieter. Visits became less frequent. Birthdays were remembered by phone rather than with presents, and small moments of affection gave way to polite distance. By 2015, it was clear Margaret could no longer live alone. She had fainting spells, struggled to walk long distances, and often forgot whether she had taken her medication. Evelyn insisted on placing her in Rosewood Nursing Home, a decision presented as practical, but one Margaret interpreted as exile. Daniel disagreed, but his voice carried little weight. He lived hours away and had long lost the authority to sway family choices. Margaret never argued. She smiled faintly when the papers were signed, kissed her grandchildren goodbye, and whispered, "Take care of each other." Yet behind her quiet acceptance, she carried a wound that no one noticed. The woman who had once opened her doors to everyone now found herself in a room with white walls, a single bed, and the hum of machines replacing the sound of family. She held onto photographs as if they were lifelines, and when nurses asked about her children, she would answer with pride, never mentioning the silence that grew heavier with each passing holiday. What the family did not know was that in those years of solitude, Margaret began to write. At first, it was in a worn leather journal, where she scribbled her memories, her regrets, and her hopes for reconciliation. Later, she began recording tapes, her voice fragile but steady, recounting stories of childhood, love, and loss. She addressed each grandchild directly, telling them of the nights she had rocked them to sleep, the mornings she had prayed for their futures, and the lessons she feared they had forgotten. These tapes became her true legacy, hidden away in a wooden box she kept locked at the foot of her bed. By the time Margaret turned 78, she had created a collection of letters and recordings that told the story of her family not as they wanted to see it, but as it truly was. Fractured, proud, but still redeemable. She believed that one day they would find her words and understand that her forgiveness had always been present, waiting to be embraced. Little did they know that the inheritance she prepared would test the very foundation of their hearts. The silence grew like a shadow that refused to leave. By the spring of 2016, Margaret's absence from family gatherings was no longer a subject of discussion, but a fact quietly accepted. Easter dinners went on without her. Birthdays were celebrated in restaurants instead of her home, and photographs shared online bore no trace of the woman who had once been the glue of every occasion. At Rosewood Nursing Home, Staff members noticed how she rarely received visits. The visitor log kept at the reception desk told the story more honestly than any family member would admit. Months often passed without a single signature from her children or grandchildren. Margaret felt the distance most sharply during the holidays. The Christmas of 2017 was especially cruel. Snow fell heavy that year, and as carols played faintly from the television in the common room, Margaret sat alone, a knitted shawl wrapped tightly around her frail shoulders. Nurses placed a small artificial tree in her room and taped a red ribbon on her door, but the room remained unbearably empty. She had hoped for a call, even just a message. None came. In her journal, she wrote with shaky hands, "It is not the silence that hurts most, but the memory of voices that used to fill these days." For the family, life moved forward. Evelyn was consumed by her work, justifying her absence with the excuse of responsibility. Daniel's visits grew even rarer, overshadowed by debts and disappointments he could not face. The grandchildren, now teenagers and young adults, carried only blurred memories of their grandmother's embrace. They began to speak of her as if she were already part of the past, a chapter quietly closing. No one realized how deeply that absence shaped them, how their own quarrels echoed. The same pattern of pride and distance that had torn the family apart before. The emotional toll on Margaret was devastating. She began to withdraw from the community activities the nursing home offered. Bingo nights, movie afternoons, and group prayers became events she attended only with her body, her spirit absent. The staff noticed her appetite fading, her weight dropping, her eyes lingering too long on the window where she watched families arrive for others. Every arrival reminded her of what she no longer had. The silence between her and her children became a kind of war, though no words were spoken. Evelyn convinced herself that her mother was cared for, that professional help was what she needed most. Daniel buried his guilt beneath excuses, saying distance made it impossible. And yet, both of them carried in their quiet moments a gnawing unease, a whisper that perhaps they had abandoned the very woman who had once sacrificed everything for them. Margaret, for her part, chose not to confront. Instead, she turned to the box at the foot of her bed. Each time she wrote a letter or recorded a tape, it was as though she was reaching across the chasm of silence. She described birthdays they had missed, lessons she hoped they remembered, and the ache she carried but never voiced. Some messages were stern, others tender, all woven with a thread of forgiveness she hoped one day would be recognized. As the years passed, the distance hardened into something heavier than mere neglect. It became shame. When nurses asked the family to attend meetings about Margaret's health, excuses multiplied. Evelyn promised to come but canceled last minute. Daniel sent apologies by phone but never showed. Each absence deepened Margaret's solitude, and with each missed chance, reconciliation seemed more impossible. The family's shame grew into avoidance, and avoidance into near erasure. But within the walls of Rosewood, Margaret's presence could not be erased. Photographs taken by staff showed her sitting by the window with the same quiet dignity, her hands folded in her lap. Records in the nursing home office detailed her steady decline. She had become a figure both invisible to her family and unforgettable to the staff who cared for her daily. The paradox was cruel. Strangers knew her final years more intimately than those bound to her by blood. The weight of these choices did not remain hidden. Evelyn, in her rare, quiet evenings, sometimes found herself staring at her mother's old sewing machine stored in her garage. Memories of Margaret working late into the night to pay for Evelyn's tuition would rise uninvited, and guilt pressed heavy on her chest. Daniel, when struggling to pay bills, remembered the times. His mother skipped meals so he could eat. Both carried the knowledge that their neglect was not born of necessity, but of pride, resentment, and a failure to face uncomfortable truths. The grandchildren, too, began to sense the absence. At family gatherings, when conversations turned to their grandmother, the room grew heavy with awkwardness. No one knew what to say. They remembered her laughter, her stories, her cookies fresh from the oven. But those memories felt too distant, too fragile, as if they belonged to another lifetime. The escalation of distance reached its cruel peak when Margaret fell ill in late 2019. Nurses urged the family to visit, reminding them of the seriousness of her condition. Once again, promises were made. Few were kept. Margaret, lying in her bed with oxygen tubes, waited with eyes fixed on the door. Hours passed. The door never opened. She whispered softly, almost to herself, maybe in another life. It was in this silence, in this unbearable emptiness, that the true weight of abandonment crystallized. And yet, in her hidden letters and fragile tapes, Margaret's voice endured. She had sewn words into time, words waiting to be discovered, words that would one day pierce the silence her family had built around her. It was the morning of January 12, 2020, when the call came. Margaret Hayes had passed quietly in her sleep at Rosewood Nursing Home. The nurse on duty recorded the exact time in the official logbook, 4:17 a.m., a number that would later feel etched into the family's conscience. Her body lay still, her expression calm, as though she had finally found the peace that eluded her during her final years. For the staff, her departure was tenderly mourned. For the family, the news landed like a stone thrown into still, water, ripples of shock, guilt, and denial spreading with force. The funeral was modest, held in a small chapel just outside Asheville. The pews were filled more with neighbors, church members, and nursing home staff than with family. Evelyn stood stiffly at the front, her eyes red but dry, her grief locked behind a wall of restraint. Daniel arrived late, guilt written across his face, his shoulders hunched as if he carried the weight of decades in a single moment. The EA, grandchildren exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to grieve for someone who had been absent in their daily lives, but not in their memories. There was no open display of reconciliation, only fragmented silence. Whispers exchanged in the hall I, and the cold presence of loss that demanded acknowledgement but received little. It was after the service that the event which would change everything occurred. Inside Margaret's nursing home room, as the staff began the careful process of gathering her belongings, they discovered a wooden box tucked at the foot of her bed. The box was old, carved with simple floral patterns, its lock fragile enough to be opened with ease. Inside lay a collection of letters sealed in individual envelopes, each with a name written in Margaret's familiar handwriting. Alongside, the letters were cassette tapes labeled with dates, voices preserved in magnetic reels of memory. And at the bottom of the box was a document, a will, notarized and signed, that revealed a truth the family had never expected. Margaret, it turned out, had left behind more than her modest savings. Over the years, she had quietly invested the little money she earned as a seamstress, placing small sums into accounts and bonds that, though modest individually, had accumulated into a sum large enough to surprise everyone. It was not the fortune of the wealthy, but it was significant, enough to change lives, to demand responsibility, to expose the irony of how the woman they had abandoned in life had prepared for them in death. When Evelyn read the first lines of the will, her hands shook. The inheritance was to be divided equally among her children and her brother's children, but it came with one condition. Before any claim could be made, the letters had to be read aloud together, as a family, in the presence of both children and grandchildren. Margaret's words would not be a private whisper, but a public reckoning, her voice echoing in the very room where her family would be forced to confront themselves. The date was set, February 2nd, 2020. They gathered in Evelyn's living room, the sealed envelopes and tapes placed on the coffee table like sacred relics. The atmosphere was heavy, the air thick with expectation and dread. The grandchildren sat in silence, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. Daniel lit a cigarette outside before coming in, his nerves betraying him. Evelyn held the first envelope with trembling hands, her breath uneven. The first letter was addressed to both Evelyn and Daniel. Margaret's handwriting, though frail, carried the clarity of someone who had chosen every word with care. She spoke of their childhood, of the nights she stayed awake sewing clothes so they could have shoes for school, of the mornings she prayed for their safety. Then the tone shifted. She wrote of her sorrow at their distance, her grief at their silence, and her deep longing that they find their way back to one another. "You left me at Rosewood," she wrote, "but I never stopped waiting for you. My love never ended. My forgiveness was already written in my heart." As the letter was read, silence fell over the room. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his jaw tight. Evelyn swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the paper, but blurred by tears she could no longer contain. The grandchildren shifted, uncomfortably, hearing truths they had never been told, truths that pierced the armor of indifference they had carried. Then came the tapes. The first one clicked into the old cassette player, its sound scratchy but unmistakable. Margaret's voice, fragile, steady, achingly alive. "If you are hearing this, it means I am gone. But I need you to know I was never angry, only hurt. And I prayed every night that you would forgive yourselves, because I forgave you long ago." The room became a chamber of ghosts, Margaret's presence filling every corner. Her words were not simply instructions or memories. They were confessions, revelations, and pleas. Each tape carried a different story, a different reminder of love given and love lost. By the time the second letter was opened, the atmosphere had changed. No one spoke. No one dared to break the sacred weight of what they were experiencing. The inheritance no longer mattered. What mattered were the words, the voice that returned from beyond silence, and the knowledge that forgiveness had been offered before they even asked. Margaret's final act was not to leave money, but to leave the possibility of reconciliation. The living room that February evening became more than a gathering space. It turned into a tribunal of memory, grief, and long-suppressed truths. The letters lay scattered across the coffee table, their envelopes torn open, Margaret's handwriting flowing like veins of light across the paper. The cassette player continued to hum with her fragile voice, and every word seemed to carve itself into the hearts of those who listened. Evelyn was the first to break. As she read through her own letter, her composure shattered. Margaret had written to her not only of love but also of responsibility. She recalled Evelyn's first day of school, the way she clutched her daughter's hand and whispered encouragement. She praised her for her strength, her teaching, her resilience, but then she asked the question Evelyn had avoided for years. Why had she allowed pride to come before compassion? Evelyn dropped the letter to her lap, tears streaming down. Her face, sobs escaping in gasps she could no longer control. For the first time in decades, she admitted aloud that she had abandoned her mother not out of necessity, but because facing her pain had been too hard. Daniel's turn came, and his shame cut even deeper. Margaret's letter to him was full of tenderness, recalling his laughter as a child, his dreams of becoming a man who would make a difference. But she also wrote of her heartbreak as she watched him drift away into excuses, debts, and absence. Her words to him were sharp but forgiving. "You ran from me, Daniel, but you were always running from yourself. I hope one day you will stop and turn back." As Daniel listened to his mother's recorded voice say those words, his hands covered his face. His body shook, not just with tears but with years of regret finally released. He stood up suddenly, pacing the room, whispering over and over, "I should have been there. I should have been there." The grandchildren, silent witnesses until then, finally felt the weight of their inheritance. Margaret had written to each of them individually. To Emily, the eldest, she recalled the nights she stayed awake telling her stories about angels and heroes. To Michael, she described the way his laughter used to fill her home, a sound she prayed he would never lose. To Sophia, she confessed how she feared the girl would forget the smell of her kitchen and the warmth of her embrace. Each letter carried not only memory, but also a plea to live lives of compassion, to never repeat the mistakes of distance and neglect that had scarred their family. As the last tape finished playing, a silence heavier than any before settled into the room. Margaret's final recorded words lingered in the air. Forgive each other. Forgive yourselves. Love one another. Because in the end, that is the only inheritance worth having. It was Evelyn who spoke first. She turned to her brother, her eyes swollen with tears, and whispered words she had not spoken in years. I'm sorry, Daniel. Her voice cracked, fragile but genuine. For a moment he stood frozen, staring at her, uncertain whether to accept or retreat into the pride that had guided him for so long. But then, almost without thinking, he crossed the room and embraced her. His body trembled against hers as he choked out his own apology. The two siblings clung to each other, their grief mingling, the years of silence dissolving in the salt of their tears. The grandchildren, moved by what they witnessed, stepped closer. Emily placed her hand on her father's shoulder. Michael leaned against his aunt. Sophia wrapped her arms around both cousins. For the first time in years, they stood together not as fractured branches of a broken tree, but as one family, bound by something greater than their shame. No one spoke of the inheritance again that night. The money lay in the sealed envelope of legal documents, forgotten on the table. What mattered were the words that had come from beyond the grave, words that carried more weight than any fortune. Margaret's voice had forced them to face themselves, to lay bare their failures, and to remember the love that had once been their foundation. They sat late into the night, retelling stories of Margaret's life. Evelyn remembered her, mother's hands guiding her through lessons at the kitchen table. Daniel recalled the time she walked miles to bring him medicine when he was sick. The grandchildren listened wide-eyed, discovering pieces of their grandmother they had never known. Every memory shared became a thread, weaving them back together, closing the gap that years of silence had created. It was nearly midnight when Evelyn whispered a thought that seemed to hang over them all. She forgave us. She forgave us long before we even thought to ask. The room grew still, and the truth of it settled into every heart. Margaret's forgiveness had not been a gift granted at the end, but a constant presence, waiting for them to recognize it. In that moment, the family understood. The true inheritance Margaret left was not the money, not the letters, not even the tapes. It was the chance to begin again, to choose reconciliation over resentment, to embrace love over silence. The burden of guilt was heavy, but the release of forgiveness was stronger. For the first time in many years, the Hayes family felt whole. The days after that night carried a different air. It was as if Margaret's presence lingered in every corner, not as a ghost to haunt them, but as a light guiding them toward a path they had long forgotten. Evelyn and Daniel spoke daily, sometimes about ordinary things, sometimes about memories they thought they had lost. The grandchildren began visiting each other more often, reconnecting through the stories their grandmother had carefully preserved for them. Slowly, the cracks that once defined their family began to heal. One afternoon, weeks later, Evelyn drove to Rosewood Nursing Home. She walked down the quiet halls where her mother had spent her final years, pausing at the door of Margaret's old room. It was empty now, stripped of the photographs and the little wooden box that had carried so much weight. She sat in the chair by the window, staring out at the garden where patients sometimes gathered, and for the first time in years, she prayed aloud. She asked for forgiveness not only from her mother, but from herself, knowing that Margaret's words had already lifted the burden she carried. Evelyn left the room with tears in her eyes, but also with a peace she had not felt in decades. Daniel found his own way of honoring their mother. He took the sewing machine that had sat in Evelyn's garage, the same one Margaret had used late into the nights, and restored it. He placed it in his living room as a reminder of her sacrifices, a silent monument to her strength. Each time he walked past it, he felt the pull of responsibility, not the heavy guilt of failure, but the steady call to live with more compassion, more presence, more courage than he had before. The grandchildren, too, changed. Emily volunteered at the local community center, teaching children how to read, inspired by the lessons Margaret had once given her. Michael began visiting the nursing home, playing guitar for the residents, offering music to those who, like his grandmother, might otherwise feel forgotten. Sophia started writing letters to her family members, determined that silence would never again steal years from their lives. Each of them, in their own way, carried forward the inheritance Margaret had left behind. As months turned into a year, the Hayes family no longer avoided gathering. Birthdays returned to being shared, dinners filled the air with laughter, and photographs once again captured them together. Whenever disagreements arose, as they inevitably did, someone always reminded the others of Margaret's words: forgive each other, forgive yourselves, love one another. Those words became a covenant, a binding promise that they would not let pride or resentment rule them again. The money Margaret left was eventually distributed, but by then it mattered little. It paid for college tuition, cleared debts, and provided comfort, but it was never spoken of as her true legacy. That legacy was something invisible, yet undeniable, a force that had reshaped the course of their lives. The letters and tapes were kept in a safe place, not as relics of guilt, but as treasures of love, to be revisited whenever the family needed to remember the cost of silence and the power of forgiveness. In the end, Margaret's story was not about being abandoned in a nursing home, nor about the inheritance revealed after her passing. It was about the endurance of love that survives even neglect, the kind of love that writes letters when voices fail, that records tapes when presence is denied, that waits patiently for hearts to return. She had shown her family that forgiveness does not erase the past but transforms it, turning wounds into lessons and absence into presence once more. The final lesson she left was simple yet profound. Forgiveness is not only for the one who receives it, but also for the one who gives it. It is freedom, a breaking of chains that binds both the guilty and the grieving. As Evelyn would later tell her children, "Grandma gave us two gifts, the courage to face ourselves and the grace to begin again." And so the Hayes family moved forward, not perfect, but united. The silence that once defined them was replaced by words, gestures, and the steady rhythm of love rediscovered. Margaret's voice no longer echoed from tapes, but from the choices they made each day, choices to honor her memory through the lives they lived. In that way, she never truly left them. Her inheritance lived on in the forgiveness they had embraced, in the reconciliation they had chosen, and in the hope that no matter how far a heart strays, love can always call it home. Because in the end, the true inheritance is not measured in dollars or possessions, but in the unseen strength of forgiveness. Margaret Hayes proved that even from beyond the silence of a nursing home room, love can speak, heal, and set free. The forgiveness she gave liberated not only those who received it, but also the woman who had carried it all along, waiting for the day her family would finally understand.